Hello, good evening, everyone. Tonight, I bring you a special discussion. I title it The Parting of the Sands, or On the Legacy of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. I'm very lucky to be joined by the Prudentialist. How are you, sir?
I'm doing quite well. Happy to be here.
So this topic we're discussing tonight, this is a topic which I first, I learned about 10 years ago. I actually discovered it through watching the grand historical epic Lawrence of Arabia, a great film for anybody who's seen that. And from there, really, what intrigued me even further is I used to read a lot of books on Kindle, but not so much anymore. I mostly do physical books now, as I think most people should. However, I remember back reading years ago, it would sometimes come up with like suggestions, and one of the suggestions I remember was for a book called A Line in the Sand by James Barr, and this whole book is about the struggle between the British and French in the Middle East as a result of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. It is an absolutely fascinating read. I've actually left an Amazon link down in the description for anybody interested. I would highly recommend that anybody who wants to read more about this topic checks out that book, because there are some, shall I say, quite interesting red pills regarding the history of this region in that book. And I've actually got the prologue here, so if you wouldn't mind, I actually would like to read it. It's only a few pages.
Let's hear it.
Right. Okay, so this is the author speaking. So, in the summer of 2007, I came across a sentence in a newly declassified British government report that made my eyes bulge. Written by an officer in the British Security Service, MI5, in early 1945, but never published until now, it solved a mystery that had been puzzling the government. Who was financing and arming the Jewish terrorists who were then trying to end British rule in Palestine? The officer, just back from a visit to the Middle East, provided an answer that was astonishing. The terrorists, he reported, would seem to be receiving support from the French. Adding that he had spoken to his counterparts in Britain's Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, the officer continued, "We know from top-secret sources that French officials in the Levant have been clandestinely selling arms to the Haganah, and we have received recent reports of their intention to stir up strife within Palestine." In other words, while the British were fighting and dying to liberate France, their supposed allies, the French, were secretly backing Jewish efforts to kill British soldiers and officials in Palestine. France's extraordinary move marked the climax of a struggle for the control of the Middle East that had been going on for at least 30 years. In 1915, Britain and France, wartime allies then too, tried to resolve the tensions that their rival ambitions in the region were causing. In the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement, they split the Ottoman Middle Eastern Empire between them by a diagonal line in the sand that ran from the Mediterranean Sea coast to the mountains of the Persian frontier. Territory north of this arbitrary line would go to France. Most of the land south of it would go to Britain, but the two powers could not agree over the future of Palestine. The compromise which neither power liked was that the Holy Land should have an international administration. Crude empire building of this type had been common in the 19th century, but was already unpopular by the time that the Sykes-Picot Agreement was signed. Chief among its critics was the American President Woodrow Wilson. When the United States declared war on Germany in 1917, he criticized European imperialism and proposed that, when the war was over, subject and stateless people should be able to choose their own destinies instead. In this new atmosphere, the British urgently needed a new basis for their claim to half the Middle East. Already in control of Egypt, they quickly realized that by publicly supporting Zionist aspirations to make Palestine a Jewish state, they could secure the exposed east flank of the Suez Canal while dodging accusations that they were land grabbing. What seemed at the time to be an ingenious way to outmaneuver France has had devastating repercussions ever since. The British knew from the outset that this move risked causing deep anger in the Muslim world, but they were confident that they could overcome it. They believed that the Arabs would recognise the economic advantages of Jewish immigration, and that the Jews would long be grateful to Britain for helping them realise their dream. Both assumptions proved to be wrong. When Jewish immigration triggered Arab outrage, British attempts to keep the peace by slowing change swiftly exasperated the Jews. Under mandates granted by the League of Nations, Britain took control of Palestine, Transjordan and Iraq, France, Lebanon and Syria. Both powers were supposed to steer these embryonic countries to rapid independence, but they immediately began to drag their feet. The Arabs reacted angrily as their freedom they had been promised continually receded before them like a mirage. The British and the French blamed one another's policies for their opposition they each began to face. Each refused to help the other address violent Arab opposition because they knew that they would only make themselves more unpopular by doing so. For almost 2 years in the 1920s, the British ignored frequent French requests to stop the rebels who were fighting their forces inside Syria from using neighbouring British-controlled Transjordan as a base. The French in turn shrugged when the British asked them to clamp down on the Arabs who were taking sanctuary in Syria and Lebanon during the insurgency in Palestine in the second half of the 1930s. Lacking neighbourly support, both France and Britain resorted to violent tactics to crush protests that only enraged the Arabs further. The French had long believed that the British were actively aiding Arab resistance to their rule, but up until the outbreak of the Second World War, this suspicion was unfounded. The fall of France in 1940 and the subsequent decision by the French in the Levant to bring back the Vichy government ended both sides' reluctance to interfere in one another's problems. In June 1941, British and Free French forces invaded Syria and Lebanon to stop the Vichy administration providing Germany with a springboard for an offensive against Suez. After the Vichy French surrendered a month later, the British government entrusted the government of Lebanon and Syria to the Free French. When that move caused Arab anger, British officials decided that the best way to divert attention away from Palestine was to help both Syria and Lebanon gain their independence at French expense. With significant British assistance, the Lebanese did so in 1943. The French found out that the British were plotting with the Syrians to do the same the following year. The French discovered that the Zionists shared their appetite for revenge, for by now, Jewish opinion had moved decisively against the British. In 1939, the British, in the bid to placate the Arabs, had imposed tight immigration restrictions that prevented large numbers of Jews fleeing Nazi Germany from reaching safety in Palestine. When news of the systematic nature and scale of the Holocaust emerged, many Jews decided it was time to throw the British out. Britain's appeasement of the Arabs' terrorism before the war had shown that violence worked. As this book reveals, the French now secretly offered to support to Zionist terrorists who shared their determination to drive the British out of Palestine. What makes this venomous rivalry between Britain and France so important is that it fueled today's Arab-Israeli conflict. Britain's use of the Zionists to thwart the French ambitions in the Middle East led to a dramatic escalation in tensions between the Arabs and the Jews, while it was the French who played a vital part in the creation of the State of Israel by helping the Jews organise a large-scale immigration and devastating terrorism that finally engulfed the bankrupt British mandate in 1948. So, after reading that, do you have any comments to make, a Prudentialist?
It does illustrate the long-standing consequences of this agreement to present day. What we get the term the Middle East from really does, I think the first earliest documented term of that phrase actually does come from Sir Mark Sykes of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And that we really do need to consider the fact that when we look at this agreement, you cannot sort of shy away from both, what you would call sort of New Israelism or British Israelism, alongside Mark Sykes' own interests in sort of the Zionist movement that would come out of the late 1900s and at the turn of the 20th century. I mean, what would be later known as the Balfour Declaration, many Zionist advocates inside the British government would call him sort of the grandfather of that agreement. And so, despite having these territorial claims inside of the Levant, or what we now know as the Middle East, it also raises the interesting question of how much of these older geopolitical questions are being addressed throughout the 19th and the 18th centuries. You're sort of looking at the question that is commonly referred to historically as the Eastern question. What do we do with the Ottoman Empire? And just a year later, what becomes the Sykes-Picot Agreement in 1916 sort of outlines the French and English interests against the Russians in this area as well, considering that just in prior 1915, you have what's the Constantinople Agreement, which how on earth do we divide the Straits alongside the Levant, where Constantinople would go to the Russian Empire. Of course, they would later fall to the Bolsheviks. But it does really illustrate that this agreement and these greater geopolitical questions, as well as with respects to Jewish interests in both Britain, but also just sort of the diaspora in general in Europe, how that part of the world has been forever changed by these 1900s era, these First World War agreements that have irreparably changed our politics and our understanding of the Middle East for as long as we'll live.
Oh, thank you for that, Prudentialist. No, I agree with pretty much everything you said there. And what's particularly tragic, again, I think the importance of having the conversation about this is it really has had the long-lasting repercussions. Again, the period which is critical is 1916 to 1948, and pretty much every major event in the Middle East, I think, as a consequence of those years. From the civil war in Lebanon, the current civil war in Syria, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and even as well as the events in Iraq, movements such as Arab nationalism, the Ba'athist Party and the consequences for the conflicts between Iraq and Iran, and later Iraq and Kuwait, and then the British-American invasion. I think all of that stems from this. So are there any kind of comments you want to make before I move on with the presentation?
The only thing I would add is that I don't know how far into your presentation it will be in there, but this also provides us what we would consider Saudi Arabia. The House of Saud, as it exists now, it had two prior existence of states, which hopefully we'll get the opportunity to go into. But the House of Saud, as we know it, really does emerge in the unification of Saudi Arabia throughout the years of 1902 until roughly 1933 or so. But that sort of Arab conflict, or the House of Saud conflict between them, the British and the Ottoman Empire, that's one of those other factors that we really do need to consider when looking at this time period of European, Levantine, or Middle Eastern policy in the region. But hopefully we'll get a chance to go into that. But yeah, let's carry on.
Certainly. Okay. So before we even get into the Middle East, what we really need to grasp with is the whole relationship between the British and the French before World War One. Because in the run-up, what essentially would happen is, for most of their history, England, Britain, and France have been rivals and have had wars. With the 100 Years' War, the wars of the 18th century, sometimes called the Second 100 Years' War, according to some historians, the Napoleonic Wars. But when you get to the 19th century, you start to see a much closer collaboration between the two powers. And indeed, you mentioned before the Eastern question, indeed, Britain and France would rush to the Ottoman Empire's aid to help preserve it against Russia in the Crimean War. And Napoleon III, the French emperor, was very much interested in being seen as the protector of the Christians in the Ottoman Empire. In fact, France would invest quite a lot into the economy, helping modernize Syria and Lebanon for building electrics and other infrastructure. And also the European powers tried to manage the Ottoman Empire's public expenditure through the creation of the OPDA, or the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. But of course, France's main rival, Germany, after 1871, also has interest in the Ottoman Empire through their Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation they signed in 1898. So, looking at the Entente Cordiale itself, so how this comes about is, obviously in the latter 19th century, we have the scramble for Africa, where all the European powers are rushing to carve up as much of Africa as possible. The key event here is an event known as the Fashoda Incident, which was in 1898. So what happens is in the early 1880s, the British are able to militarily occupy Egypt, which had been an Ottoman governorate known as the Khedivate of Egypt. However, when they try to secure the Sudan, which was part of Egypt, there's the famous siege of Khartoum, where General Gordon is killed by the Sudanese, and the British withdraw for over the next decade. However, the French, under General Le Marchand, land and plan an expedition across Africa in 1898, heading towards Sudan. The British, fearing that the French are about to intrude into their sphere of influence, set upon, under General Kitchener, the rapid conquest of the Sudan. And after the defeat at the Battle of Omdurman of the Sudanese, the British-Egyptian force rapidly marches south, meeting the French at Fashoda, where the French have already planted their flag. The French are then humiliatingly forced to withdraw due to the superior British force in the area. So on this map on the left, you can see Africa in 1898. You see when Marchand has landed over here in French Somaliland. He's marched through Ethiopia to Fashoda, met the British, been seen off, and then he marches across Africa to the French Congo. So after this has happened, obviously the French relations with Britain were very weak. However, after this had happened, the British realised that in the broader geopolitical scene, they may need to work with the French in order to help secure their own geopolitical interests. So what ends up happening in 1904, they signed the Entente Cordiale. This is French and English. It roughly translates to the cordial or the good agreement or understanding. So, because it's a common misconception that this was some military alliance, which it was certainly not intended in 1904. It was purely meant to be some cooperation on recognising their mutual spheres of influence. So out of this agreement, the French recognised the British influence in Egypt and the Sudan, while the British recognised the French presence in North Africa and their desire to set up a protectorate in Morocco. And as you can see in the middle of the slide, I actually have a cartoon from Punch magazine from the early 1900s. Though I understand it's satire and not strictly facts, I think it's a good indicator of the attitude at the time, because though it was not intended as a military alliance or by any way anti-German, it was very much perceived in that way, because you can see here Britain being personified by John Bull walking off with the harlot Marianne to a scorned Germany. And indeed, these suspicions of Germany would be confirmed, as later on over Morocco there would be two crises, the Tangier crisis of 1905 and the Agadir crisis of 1911. In both cases, Germany tries to prevent the French establishing a protectorate over Morocco. In the first instance, this leads to a conference of all the European powers at Algeciras in Spain, seen in the image on the right. All the European powers, bar Austria-Hungary, support the French. So again, after the French have landed their military and have slowly been conquering Morocco, in 1911, the Germans make their second attempt to prevent a French conquering Tangiers, because the Germans had significant economic concessions in that port. So they send a lone cruiser, the SMS Panther, to try and deter the French. This completely fails, as again the British back up the French. So from 1904 to 1914, we see the transformation of the Entente Cordiale from this sort of simply pact of cooperation and recognising the mutual spheres of influence to a full-out military alliance with the outbreak of the First World War. Is there any comment you want to make on what I've said so far with the slide, Prudentialist?
Sure. So one of the things that I think is also very important to keep in mind when we put out the colonial background in this is also just the growing British concern of what is often associated with a term called power transition theory. So you're beginning to see that Germany, of course, is rather historically a little late to the scramble for Africa. This is in part due to German unification. But you've got German East Africa, as you have there on your map. Onto your left, you have Benin and I think Togo as well. And so the second Boer conflict, the Second Boer War, really is where Britain finally realizes that its concern is squarely within the eyes of to deal with our continental rival. And of course, this historically, what we call the Entente Cordiale, goes back to an 1848 from, I think, Earl of Aberdeen. He's one of the few gentlemen that worked alongside Clemens von Metternich and others to associate sort of the Congress of Europe system. And he had explained in 1848 that the relationship between France and Britain at this time was finally of good understanding and good relationship. And it's been used now in this sort of new understanding, what would come out in 1904. And at this point in time, you're absolutely right that it's not a military alliance at all, but it did compose of three major issues. And the first one, I think, is that this is the enforcement of the Convention of Constantinople, which is an 1888 agreement signed by the United Kingdom, the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Spain, France, Italy, the Netherlands, the Russians, and the Ottomans. And I think whatever existed of the then Egyptian government powers. But at the same time, like, this is allowing the access to ports. Free passage through the Suez Canal was finally guaranteed. The British had promised to allow the French to provide assistance in Morocco. So while not strictly a military alliance or anything like that, it's also important to consider that you're finally beginning to see their relationship form here. And also that the Entente Cordiale is one of three alliances that to this day the French government still recognizes between the North Atlantic Alliance, or what we would be seeing with NATO, and then the European Defense Union starting in 1993. But of course, this allowed them to finally settle also various other border disputes, whether that be around the Niger River, Thailand, Madagascar, Vanuatu, all these sort of things to sort of begin to illustrate that Western realist concept of spheres of influence and territorial sovereignty among their protectorates and colonial interests in here. So really what we're seeing here now is that there is this alliance that is beginning to emerge that is both economic, beneficial towards the domestic and also the foreign. And I think it's very important for us to consider that the foreign policy of any nation usually starts at home, and we should always be paying attention to the diplomats and the individuals that are putting these things behind pen to paper.
Thank you for all of that, Prudentialist, and I'm very glad you brought up the mention of the earlier discussion of the Entente Cordiale with Lord Aberdeen there, because you could very much argue that this Entente Cordiale is the second Entente Cordiale, the first one being the cooperation between the British and specifically the French Empire under Napoleon III, because as I mentioned before, the Crimean War, and obviously that comes to an end when the British stay neutral in the Franco-Prussian War, which sees the fall of the Second French Empire and the unification of Germany and the establishment of the Third Republic in France. So yes, this is very much, you could say, a second Entente Cordiale. And right, if there's no comment you want to make, I'll move on with the presentation.
I think we're good for the next slide.
Okay, so before we get into the war proper, we need to, as you mentioned, look at the Eastern question. So here is a map of the Ottoman Empire from the early 20th century. I forget the exact year. I think it's 1909, might be 1911. But what you see, these are all the different, basically, provinces of the empire. The formal name for them were vilayets, and each vilayet was broken up into sanjaks, which I believe is still the contemporary Turkish term for their provinces. So if you look at the Middle East, you can see that these different provinces, these vilayets, don't quite accommodate the modern borders of the countries in this region. In fact, if you look at this pink one in the north of Syria, the Aleppo vilayet, that straddles the borders of modern-day Syria and Turkey. Even more interestingly is if you look at where modern-day Lebanon is, most of the bulk of Lebanon, the area around Mount Lebanon, where the Arab Christian population resides, this has an autonomous status because the Ottoman Empire had a special governor for this area as well as the lower parts of Palestine. These were the Mutassafarats. These special governorships were designed specifically for these religious minorities of the Christians in Mount Lebanon, as well as the Druze there, and then the Christians and Jewish population of Palestine. And so when the rest of Lebanon, they actually have Beirut, the coastal area of Syria, as well as northern Lebanon, and then the coastal part of northern Palestine all together in another vilayet. Over there in the green between Iraq and Syria, you can see the Deir Zor, again, that straddles the borders between both countries. But then further on, you can see the three vilayets that make up the core of what is modern-day Iraq. You've got Basra, Baghdad, and Mosul in the north there. So, based on this map, is there any sort of comment you want to make, or?
Yeah, I think that the only thing that would be a real important takeaway here is that you see those special protectorates that are lying down for religious minorities, Druze, Alawites, and the Christians of that area. And I'm sure we'll get into it later on, but these sort of protectorate systems for these religious minorities, these will disappear very, very quickly, and we're going to see this be... a lot of that will be due to the inability to directly govern through the mandate system, which comes after World War I and the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire. And it's just one of those historical tragedies that we're still witnessing to this day. And while modern Lebanon, after its civil war, has been able to maintain a tenuous relationship with proportional representations of Christians, Muslims, Alawites, and other religious minorities, the rest of the region that's been more or less obliterated.
No, absolutely. And so, again, as before, we're talking about the Christians in Lebanon. going back to Napoleon III and his desire to be the protector of the Eastern Christians, which led to the war with Russia over this question. So the French connection to Lebanon, because Lebanon would be part of their mandate later on, goes back to this time, and even further. The French had lots of extraterritoriality, even going back to the 17th and the 18th century in this area. And in fact, the French have a position, the sort of the High Commissioner for the Levant, who was actually a diplomat representing French interests, was actually based in Beirut from the 19th century. And as I mentioned before, the French did significantly invest in the infrastructure and the modernization of this region. So you could say their policies were very much a continuation of their diplomacy from the previous century.
Absolutely. I mean, the amount of French expenditures into public road systems, wells, education, and hospitals were probably the highest of any other European imperial power in that region. And they had the opportunity to. I mean, by the 1848 revolutions, it was sort of the common held position amongst both aristocracy and revolutionary leaders that Turkey is the Ottoman Empire is the sick man of Europe. And this has only been compounded, of course, by things that had happened throughout the 19th century, explicitly the war for Greek independence, and then following that, of course, the Crimean War, and then the Russo-Turkic War in the 1840s, or no, 1820s, excuse me. And so all of these things that you kind of see play out here illustrates that there's a lot of interest for religious claims, and what would eventually tout out as the Great Eastern Crisis sort of hits it about when it comes to the Herzegovina uprising in the 1870s. You have Bulgaria rebelling as well. The Ottoman Sultanate does not have the capacity to do so, and this is where you really begin to see that sort of Eastern question rise up again, right? Where we have the French and British trying to prop up what's left of the sick man of Europe in respects to also Russia and then these other smaller principalities that they don't really know what much to do about. And you're going to kind of see that play out, especially in World War I, right before the outbreak of the First World War, where while there's this sort of tenuous relationship between France and the Russian Empire, kind of had to have been awkward to see then diplomats of France, play the Marseillaise inside of Russia. But we'll get to that soon. But again, the backdrop of all these various uprisings against the Sultanate, the French interests that have lied here since the Napoleonic era, and what's played out in terms of investment for wanting to protect Eastern Christians, as well as to have claims to the Holy Land and have that properly governed outside of the hands of the Sultanate, really do start being these backdrops, but also these important historical factors to consider leading up to the original agreement in 1916.
Thank you for that. And you mentioned Greek independence there, because I think that's crucial when looking at the British and French relationship with the Ottoman Empire, because it's pretty much a case of pure whiplash, because you have the situation where Britain and France are supporting Greek independence, which significantly weakens the Ottoman Empire. Then they go to propping up the Ottoman Empire and investing in it heavily throughout the rest of the 19th century. And then here they are, nearly 100 years after Greek independence, and wishing to carve it up again. So it just seems rather preposterous in some ways. But I guess the situation had changed, because I think it's important to look at why did the Ottoman Empire end up on aligning with the Central Powers. And what's crucial, as I've mentioned earlier, that from 1898 you have this Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation between the Turks and the Germans, where the Germans are now going to start heavily investing into the Ottoman Empire and helping them modernize their army. Very famously, you've got the Berlin to Baghdad Railway, which begins construction shortly after this treaty. It wouldn't be finished too well into the 1940s, but by the time of World War I, they've built it across Anatolia, and it has reached Iskenderun, formerly known as Alexandretta, which is in southeastern Turkey near Syria. But also, that's not the only railroad. They also build a much more successful railroad, which is known as the Hejaz Railroad, which runs from Damascus all the way down to the holy cities of Medina and Mecca. The Germans are also interested, because they work with prospectors to start searching for oil in Iraq. So that was something also very much concerning to the British and the French. So in terms of the Turks' actual entry onto the war, because what this is precipitated by is that shortly after the war proper begins, the Germans have two cruisers, the Gerben, and I forget the name of the other one, but the two cruisers, they leave ports in the Austrian Empire's Adriatic ports. They're pursued by the British, who chase them all the way to Constantinople. The Ottomans give them safe refuge, which badly damages relations between the Turks and the Entente powers. In retaliation for this, the British, who were actually building two dreadnoughts for the Ottoman fleet, do not hand those ships over and keep them for themselves, which further damages relations between the two. And then what's also important is the government of Turkey is ruled by the Committee of Union and Progress, better known as the Young Turk Party, who have been in power since a revolution in 1908. So the Young Turks are Turkish nationalists who have dreams of pan-Turkism. So considering the fact that the Central Powers are at war with the Russian Empire, they enter war on the side of the Central Powers in hope of creating some grand Turkish states across Central Asia. And as we've seen in hindsight, that was an absolutely terrible decision from their perspective. So is there any other comment you want to make before we move on?
The one thing I would add is also sort of the economic factors of the Ottoman Empire leading up to sort of the Young Turks being in there. The latter half of the 19th century sort of illustrates, and it reminds me very similarly to what has happened here in my own country, here in America, is that you sort of you promote these policies of free trade, and you promote this sort of vast open market liberalization, and the domestic manufacturers of the country had been sort of utterly wiped out. In fact, Benjamin Disraeli, the prime minister, during a debate in the 1840s over corn laws, had talked about free trade, and it had destroyed some of the finest manufacturers of the world, the former late prime minister had said. And so the consequence of competition has been pernicious. And so at the same time, you have this vast amount of public debt that has been expansively gotten worse since the Crimean War. It also just doubled down a depression by the Panic of 1873. The agricultural sector had just nearly bottomed out and collapsed. There was a default in 1875, so there were numerous debts that were owed to European countries as well as their citizens. And so they had lobbied for intervention and for support. That later becomes, I think, the Office of Public Debt Administration, or Ottoman Public Debts. But it sort of does illustrate that there's a lot of issues going on here that makes it hard for them to sort of stand up on their own 2 feet in this respect. And that also sort of plays into the backdrop of why there's so much French and British investment, but also more French than anyone else, because they have to rely on the outside powers to invest in them. So this becomes a country that has seen substantial amount of deindustrialization, a widespread crisis of public debt, which was slowly being restructured and reformulated towards the end of the 19th century. And you're almost entirely dependent at this point on foreign direct investment when it comes to getting outside assistance from other European powers, because you still have to deal with your ongoing geopolitical concerns. And what are your concerns? Well, you still have to worry about the Greeks. You still have to worry about later on these new territories that have rebelled against the Sultanate. And of course, you still have the Russian Empire to deal with. So I think that the economic situation of the Ottoman Empire is a very important thing to keep in mind for what plays out in the war and the diplomacy thereafter.
Thank you. So with the next slide, so this is a ethnic map of the Ottoman Empire at the time of World War I. So you can see that in this area that we're talking about that was affected by Sykes-Picot, you can see it's predominantly Arab, Sunni Arab, but you can see there are many minorities. So in northern, what is modern day Iraq, you can see there's a Turkic population, there is Kurds, there's also Kurds in northern Syria. You also notice at the time there was a Armenian minority on the coast there in Syria, as well as in the city of Aleppo, as well as a Turkic population. The Armenian genocide carried out throughout the war would eliminate all of those quite tragically. But also, as you mentioned before, Prude, there is the Maronites and the Druzes in Lebanon and Syria. There's also Jewish colonies down in Palestine. So, though predominantly Arab, there are many different ethno-religious groups that are scattered about this territory. So, any comment you want to make before we move on?
I would just tell the audience to keep this map burned into your mind when you consider the consequences of what came after the war and present day, because this, like you had mentioned with the Armenian genocide and then later with the creation of the Jewish state in Israel, what you're seeing here just does not exist anymore.
No, indeed it doesn't. Right, so for the Sykes-Picot Agreement itself, so in the middle, this is the original plan for the Sykes-Picot Agreement. So as you can see, there are two zones. So in the B zone, this is the British zone. In the A zone, this is the French zone. So for anybody who's seen the modern borders, you will realise that this map doesn't quite align with what actually happened. So we will get into that. But from its original agreement, you can see that in the pink bit in Iraq, that is the area for British direct administration. So southern Iraq in the area around Basra. So this is mainly for commercial and maritime purposes. And then you have the rest of this zone. This would be part of a future Arab state, but this side would have British influence. On the other side, the blue zone was going to be the area under direct French administration. So most of the coastal Levant, so Lebanon and coastal Syria, but also areas of southwestern Turkey, as you can see as well, going right up into Anatolia there. And then in the A zone, this would be the other side of an Arab state that would have French influence. And then if you look over at modern-day Palestine, you can see that it's yellow. This is to designate the fact that it was going to be an international zone, with the exception of the port of Acre and Haifa, which would be a British port, again for maritime and commercial purposes. So in terms of how this came about, so I think it's worth looking at the two principal figures, the diplomats who, I should say that the treaty was named after, Sykes and Picot. So Sykes, if we're going to be honest, was of the pair was the least serious of the pair. He was someone he was a British MP. He had spent some of his childhood and youth travelling around the Middle East. He actually wrote a lot of travel books, including one called I believe it's called The Caliph's Last Treasure. And so what he did is, because during the war, he was invited to cabinet meetings to meet with the Prime Minister, as well as people such as Lord Kitchener, to discuss what to do with the Ottoman Empire. And he was seen, because he'd visited the Middle East and written all these guides, he was seen as some expert, when in reality he was letting on a lot more than he actually knew. And I think from his mind, he was just trying to advance his own career, essentially, by trying to implement successful policy for the British. His counterpart, Monsieur Georges Picot, he is a much more serious figure, because prior to the war, he was actually, I mentioned previously that the French have this sort of commissioner delegate in Beirut who represents French interests. Well, that was none other than Georges Picot himself. So he's a man who has been operating in this region and knows a lot of the local Arab elite, and he knows that there are many Arab nationalists based in this region. And his initial plan when the war broke out is, once the Turks had joined the war and he had to leave, he actually organises for arms from Greece and weapons to be granted to Arab nationalists to sponsor an uprising in the region. And then he leaves, believing that he can convince the French government to come in and do a direct military landing to set off a massive revolt across the Ottoman Empire's Arab territories. At this time, the French government are not interested in doing this, because they're busy trying to prevent the Germans from taking Paris. So nothing happens, and this Arab revolt is completely crushed. And a lot of key Arab intellectual figures are jailed or imprisoned as a result of this. So with Georges Picot's as the counterpart to Sykes, so again, he's someone who intimately has knowledge of this area, and he's also, shall we say, he very much emphasises with France's colonial struggle against Britain. He was someone who actually, I believe before he became a diplomat, he was trained to become a lawyer, but the Fashoda incident is what convinces him to become a diplomat, because he felt he wanted to do what he could for France to make sure she could acquire her interest on the world stage. And so that's very much what motivated him. Is there any comment you want to make on either of these two figures, Prude?
I find Sir Mark Sykes actually to be a really interesting character. In part just because there's a lot. I know that there are rumors of him being more or less a drunkard. I tend to disagree with those takes. I find him to be an interesting socialite in that respect. Like you had said, he had wrote numerous travel books. He had said through 5 Turkish provinces, the home of Islam, the short history of the Turkish Empire, talking about the political geography of the area. So later he ends up working for Lord Kitchener during the war. And of course, this treaty that he's famously known for, he doesn't actually have his legacy is really more or less attached to his name because he dies during the Paris peace treaty, and Versailles dies in 1919. But he's also, if you want to have a little bit of poking of fun, he did study at a Jesuit college, though he did not finish his degree. But at his time, of course, he had fought in the Second Boer War. He had tried numerous times running for Parliament, finally got in. But he was also seen as a man who would run the Department of Intelligence alongside with Lord Kitchener during the First World War. And like you had mentioned, that of course they were trying to advocate for some kind of rebellion amongst the Arab states, which of course that would put Britain in a rather serious position, because Britain, of course, at the same time, has always viewed the sick man of Europe as to sort of be this important buffer against the Russian Empire, which had been quickly trying to modernize after its defeat against the Japanese in the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. And so they were concerned that as Russia continues to modernize and develop its navy, that Russia might be cutting off British trade in the Mediterranean, which is why you see all these back and forth agreements between, say, the Italians, the Russians, the French, the British, over respects to what would happen in the Middle East or in the Levant. But Mark Sykes is just this delightfully interesting character where, he's sort of seen as this rival to Lawrence of Arabia, T.E. Lawrence, to a point where I think Lawrence calls him the imaginative advocate of unconvincing world movements and a bundle of prejudices. So just sort of these differing views about this in this case. But he's incredibly interesting in that respect. And as I had mentioned at the beginning, he, despite being a Roman Catholic, Sir Mark Sykes is what you would call, by many historians, including Cecil Bloom, is a quote convert to Zionism. And many biographies of Sykes would say that he's a unique product, considering his Jesuit education, his travels throughout the Middle East, and developing a policy that would be backed by Winston Churchill with splitting the Arabs from the Turks. But he seems that he's also considered to be the arranging of the preliminaries to the Balfour Declaration. And so many would consider him to have numerous sympathies towards not only just the Jews, but also Christian minorities in that area. He had visited Syria and other countries to study them and understand that. That's why you kind of get these books about the political and religious geography of the Ottoman Empire. Of course, he had a background in his travels being somewhat finding these groups of people repulsive, but at the same time, he would later change his opinion on that. And towards 1917, he was very much pressuring Lloyd George and Balfour, and the declaration needs to take place. And so I think that it's important that this one man who dies shortly right after World War I, he dies in 1919, he was a man that had pushed for, these Arab uprisings, and at the same time providing intelligence, having his travel socialite background and the sort of man about town sort of attitude. He's also vital for sort of getting these sort of Israeli or Zionistic interests being pushed by the British government, while at the same time sort of taking on new positions with respects to the Ottoman Empire. So I find him to be an interesting character. I think he deserves a sort of historical biographical stream in and of his own right. But the other thing that I would just add about his French counterpart, who, of course, lived much longer. He lived to the 1950s, but lawyer, diplomat in the 1880s. He was part of the policy directorate. He was in all sorts of places, whether it be Copenhagen, Beijing, and then Beirut shortly before the war. And so he was out there, had a close relationship with many of those in the Lebanese, particularly religious minorities like the Marianites and others. And in those discussions over the treaty, he's far more aware, I think, than just say Picot, than Sykes. Because Picot is looking at this very much on the lines of where are French economic investments being put along. And I'm glad that you had mentioned a lot of these railways and these investments because, France, per Picot's interests, he really wants all of Syria, all of Palestine, and that there needs to be like a really clear border between Egypt and whatever exists left of Turkey, and that we can work out everything from there. But it does sort of illustrate that these agreements and these back and forth discussions between these two men that would be signing off on the map that you have on screen at sites A and B sort of highlights the desire to ensure that there's protection of these people, but at the same time that all economic interests are invested in and secured, because at the same time, no matter what comes out of this, and this is in 1916, so this is a year before the revolution, they still want to find a way to undercut the Russian Empire, because the Mediterranean has always been and continues to be the lifeblood of a lot of trade between the Levant, North Africa, and Europe. And that's all I've got to say.
Yes, indeed, because as an ancillary treaty, there was the Paleolog-Sazonov Treaty, where Britain and France agree that in a post-war carve-up of the Ottoman Empire, Russia is to finally gain the coveted Constantinople, the Second Rome, and the Straits, and is also going to be granted control over what is now Greater Armenia in eastern Anatolia as well. But if you want my opinion, I don't think the British would have allowed the Russians Constantinople in the long term personally. But in terms of Russia's naval power, we must remember that Russia's naval strength had been massively weakened following the Russo-Japanese War, as their Pacific Fleet and their Baltic Fleet were both sunk. So the only significant fleet they had left was the Black Sea Fleet, which was being contained by Turkey's navy. And another point to look at as well, I just also want to talk about the wider diplomatic negotiations going on, because remember, the Middle East is only one part of the sphere of influence that Britain and France want to carve up out of the post-war settlement. So other than these two, the other figures we need to bear in mind are you have Edward Grey, who's the foreign minister for Britain, and Delcasse, who's the French foreign minister, and the go-between, who is Paul Cambon, who was the French ambassador to London. So you've got all those figures as well in considerations, with Sykes and Picot just mostly dealing with this one aspect of all the negotiations between the two powers. And another point as well is, on the French side, there's a powerful lobby group called the Comité des Français Asie, or the Committee for French Asia. This lobby group are pressuring for as much territorial concessions in the Middle East as possible. And it's also noteworthy that Georges Picot is a member of this committee. Any other point you want to raise, Prude? Or?
I'm trying to think if there really is one. And this, and with respects to the Middle East, I mean, the only thing that I think really is important to also keep in mind when we talk about these territories, especially with the map that we have here, you'll notice that sort of the eastern, or I guess in this context, the western part of Anatolia is not really pictured. This sort of gets addressed later on, a year after, in 1917, with famously the agreement of Saint Jean de Maurienne, the sort of rail car agreement about what to do with respects to, with David Lloyd George, Sidney Sonino, and a lot of the Italians were there as well, sort of to just talk about how can we get a Middle Eastern, part of the deal with respects to Italy's own interests at the time. Of course, trying to balance power as the war continues to go on. This is at the same time in the backdrop of this is right before the October Revolution. This is right before, and this is at the same time coupled with the Russian retreat out of the Caucasus, and at the same time, right, this is sort of trying to understand, well, how are we going to maintain that sort of same balance of powers, Westphalian, now, Congress system inside of the Middle East with these European protectorates. And I just think that that kind of thinking, while would be rapidly destroyed post World War II, with respects to sort of decolonialism, and a lot of that being pushed by the American government, that you're beginning to see the formulation of European colonial thought inside the Middle East and the Levant. And there are so much of our problems today, as we mentioned at the introduction, are based off of these agreements and the failure of direct rule and foreign influences, as well as various ethnic lobbying inside as well.
Well, thank you for those points. One other thing I want to say before we move on to the next slide is it bears to be said that the Sykes-Picot Agreement, when it was conceived, was a secret treaty. So only the Britain, France, Italy, and Russia and other Entente powers knew of the agreement. It was internationally not known that they were planning this post-war because, as you can imagine, it was, as was mentioned in that prologue from James Barr in The Line in the Sand, it was empire building of this arbitrary nature was quite controversial in the political climate, so it made sense given the time. So, okay, we've mentioned before Lawrence of Arabia and the Arab Revolt. So Britain deals mostly with the negotiation with the Arabs. The French aren't particularly involved. So before the war actually started and Britain knew they were going to be at war with the Turks, within the Ottoman Empire, in this coastal area of modern-day Saudi Arabia, known as the Hejaz region, the main character is the Sharif of Mecca and Medina, Emir Hussein. His family, the Hashemite family, have links with Arab nationalists and are thinking of causing an uprising. His second son, Abdullah, approaches the British and asks for aid in starting an uprising. At this point, the British aren't interested. But later on, when the war breaks out, they make touch with Hussein again. And there are two maps here. So on the left-hand side, this is a map and agreement which was drawn up between Sir Henry Macmahon, who was the British High Commissioner for the Middle East, who was based in Egypt. So he was essentially the British Empire's sort of diplomatic point man for the region. His negotiations with Emir Hussein, now King Hussein, who had proclaimed himself king of the Hejaz region. So in their negotiations, I'm sorry about the quality of this map, but I can do my best to guide everybody. So the area in red is the territory that was going to be given to the Arabs. So you have all of modern day the Arabian Peninsula, you have Palestine, you have most of Syria, and you have all of Iraq. And then the British are going to be still maintain their ports in northern Palestine in Acre and Haifa, and the French are going to be given their coastal strip. So the Arabs in this agreement were not too happy about the foreign presence, but were willing to tolerate it, believing that in the long run they'd be able to acquire this territory. And also in the wording of this treaty, the British were deliberately vague in terms of their promises, just so they could get the Arabs on side without making any hard promises. So as we can see, the territorial promises in this correspondence completely contravenes what was in the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And so going on to the Arab Revolt, yes, this is largely spearheaded by Lawrence of Arabia, better known as T. Lawrence of Arabia. So he leads this armed uprising of the Arabs against the Turks, and the principal Arab figure is Hussein's third son, Emir Faisal. What's actually interesting is the Arabs really, because at this point, the rebels control Mecca, but they don't control Medina, which is the other holy site of Islam. There were concerns where, because at this point, the British were giving a significant aid of supply, resources, and money to the Arab cause. There was a belief that if they took Medina, which was the other holy city, the British would withdraw all support from their movement. So Lawrence plans, because he's very much sympathetic to the Arab cause and wants to help them achieve their aims as much as possible, plans on launching them north past Medina up and taking the port. Famously, he takes the port of Aqaba, which is modern-day Jordan's port on the Red Sea. From there, he makes a famous name for himself, and the Arabs begin to push north as they harass the Ottoman army and cut off and destroy much of the railroad infrastructure in this region. It's important at this point that Lawrence has no knowledge of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. So when he's aiding the Arabs, he believes he's fulfilling the goals of the British government. And it's only in 1917, when he has a meeting with Mark Sykes, that Sykes reveals the treaty to him. Lawrence is understandably very upset by this, as he's realised that he's been unintentionally lying to the Arabs this whole time. So from this point, his plan is essentially to deliver the British government a fait accompli. If he can help the Arabs physically occupy as much territory as possible, then he can say, well, you can't take this territory because the Arabs occupy it, forcing their hand to grant these territories to them. And actually, on the right-hand side, towards the end of the war, Lawrence makes a visit to the Eastern Committee, which is part of the British War Cabinet. So this is essentially an interest group within the British government that were looking at British interest in this region. And Lawrence proposes a compromise between the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the original correspondence between Hussein and Henry and MacMahon. Most of the territory will be given to the Arabs, but it would essentially be a series of... There'll be one independent state here, as we can see, that's in the bulk of Syria and Jordan, ruled by Faisal. Iraq would be ruled by his older brother Abdullah as a British protectorate, and potentially the younger brother Zayed was going to be given another Arab state in the northern part of Mesopotamia, northeastern Syria. They would also, crucially, consent to Palestine being an international zone for Jewish settlement. In fact, there was actually a photo you can find of Faisal meeting with Shane Wiseman, a prominent prominent Zionist who would later go on to become the first president of Israel. And also, as we can see here, the Arabs in this plan still concede to a small French concession around Lebanon. So based on what I've said so far regarding the Arab interest, do you have anything to add, Prude?
I would let people know, of course, just how much investment there was going into this along. And again, two simultaneous things that are happening at the same time. You have the Arab Revolt, and then at the same time you have these sort of private discussions about how are we going to carve up the Levant and the Middle East, and how are we going to maintain a balance of power between French, Italian, Ottoman, and British interests in the area as well. And so by 1916, the French, of course, have spent over 1 million francs trying to subsidize it, and the British were spending, by the end of the war, £222,000 a month. That's not adjusted for inflation, so that's 1918 pounds, spending $220,000 a month to maintain this. And of course, at the same time, I mean, I think the betrayal scene, you can kind of see this in the film Lawrence of Arabia, but I mean, it also does illustrate just sort of the strategies of what we kind of been seeing inside of occupying imperial forces in the region. For instance, in the Hejaz region that they're going after, it only had about 20,000 men around 1917. By the time, of course, the revolt starts off, this is reinforced, but historians to this day still argue over how strong the forces of the revolt forces were. Some say as high as 30,000 men. Some say that, it kept more or less around, with Faisal and his Bedouins at first were around 5,000 at most. But it does sort of just illustrate how much of an interest there was in this region. And so I don't have too much else to add other than that this is a very hefty investment that you're seeing in wartime to maintain and put up this more or less second front against the Ottoman Empire, while their ongoing efforts, say in the Dardanelles, with respects to Gallipoli, falter and fall apart.
So just something to add onto the Gallipoli point. Yes, that was a complete failure for the Entente forces, largely the fault of Winston Churchill, as it was his idea. Just one in the many series of blunders throughout his political career, but that's besides the point. He will resurface in this conversation later. But what's also interesting, Prude, is what actually didn't happen regarding Allied landings, because I don't know if you're aware, there was actually a planned second Entente invasion. The British were planning to invade the Hatay region of Turkey, which is the city of Alexandretta, modern-day Iskenderun. The reason they were thinking of doing this is because this is where the end of the Berlin-Baghdad Railway had met. So it was a major port on the Mediterranean. It was a major supply hub before you get further into the Levant and Damascus and all the southern region. So if they were able to take this, they could have essentially cut off the southern part of the Ottoman Empire from the heartland, significantly weakening the positions of the Ottomans, making it much easier to close in and destroy them. But they don't do this. Why? Because the French, this is actually something you'll see throughout this entire period of our conversation, that the British and French don't fully trust each other, especially the French don't trust the British, and they believe that if the British militarily occupy Alexandretta, it would present the French, they believe the British will then simply not hand that region over to them because the British occupy it. So the French poo-poo any plans to do that, which, in my opinion, significantly hindered any war plans of this region. And furthermore, I mentioned before about there being a protectorate in Iraq. One of the reasons for there's protectorate there is because from the beginning of the war and throughout it, there was the Mesopotamian campaign where British Indian forces had landed at Basra and were slowly advancing their way quite rapidly early in the war up Mesopotamia until they reach Kut, and they are trapped inside for a long period of time. So again, another reason why the attack on Alexandretta does seem a bit, or the lack of an attack seems unfortunate, because if they attacked, they possibly could have helped relieve some pressure on those thousands of British troops that would eventually surrender at Kut. So essentially, the protectorate there was a concession to the fact that the British had a significant military presence in that region.
I think another thing to also add too is that while there is significant French interest in Palestine, the British have also been substantially there as well. Famously, I think Horatio Kitchener, while he would die in action in 1916, earlier in his career, he would play a large role as being a surveyor inside of Palestine, working within the Palestine Exploration Fund. He would, understand more of the Jordan River, collect survey data for the British Empire, use grid systems that we understand for modern mapping, and still they're being used by archaeologists to this day. But it does illustrate that there's also been a substantial amount of British investment into this region as well, and that we those things have to play a large role in our understanding of this area as well, despite the French being more invested in there. But I think that those are things to consider.
Well, thank you for mentioning them. And one of the points I want to make before I move on from this slide is that obviously when the British are negotiating with the Arabs, this is completely behind the French back. The French have no idea this is going on initially. They do eventually find out what the British are doing, and they confront them during diplomatic meetings. And what essentially the French do is they pressure the British by arguing, why are you doing this to us? And the British say, well, why should we give you this territory? We're the ones who are funding and fighting and dying to take it when you're not doing so. And the French counter with, well, we've sustained the majority of the casualties in the Western Front of the war. We're doing most of the fighting. France has been badly damaged. We demand compensation for this. And the British are essentially guilt tripped into still giving the French interest consideration. And from there, we come to the Zionist interest. So you've mentioned earlier, but in 1917, the British government makes the Balfour Declaration. So this is from the Foreign Secretary, Arthur Balfour, to Walter Rothschild, second Baron Rothschild, obviously the head of the Rothschild family at the time, and also the leader of the Jewish Zionist lobby group. So I will read this declaration in full. Foreign Office, November 2nd, 1917. Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I should be grateful if you would bring the declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. So after reading that and considering everything we discussed in the previous slide, so the British government are trying to negotiate carving up the Middle East with the French, as well as making grandiose promises that contravene each other with the Arabs and the Jewish interests back home. So if you want my opinion, this is a recipe for complete disaster, as we would see. Is there any comment you want to make?
Well, while still being on YouTube, I suppose. One comment I will make, though, is that this declaration kind of flies as sort of the answer and response to a lot of criticism, both by non-Jewish Zionists, but also numerous Jewish Zionist supporters inside Britain that looked at the Sykes-Picot agreement. And what seemed to be rather concerning was that there were individuals like Weizmann, like you had said, would be the first president of Israel. Many of them, when they saw the agreement, they looked at the future of Palestine would be under joint French-British control, not just British control, which would prevent any sort of Zionist, objectives from being accomplished, because you would still have to deal with the French. So while it was being hammered out in 1916, the agreements being hammered out the way that it did, numerous individuals ranging from, Herbert Samuel especially, we're seeing a lot more pressure happening inside the British government to push for Jewish colonization and cultural development in any part of the Palestinian area that would be annexed by the British Empire after the war, should the British Empire win. And this, of course, sort of coincides during a trip to St. Petersburg. Sykes would go there in March of 1916, and his growing interest in Zionism would expand while he was visiting Russia at that time. Of course, this is before the Russian Empire had fallen. And so the other thing to also keep in mind is that there's also some lobbying efforts for this to take place from an American Jewish diaspora inside of the just inside of the United States. So there's Jewish papers that are advocating for it. They were strongly supportive of it. And so you sort of see this as an effort to get also the United States into the war. And so at the same time, you have this agreement, then you have the Balfour Declaration, and then there is substantial ethnic pressure both inside America and its government to join the war and see this as a potential avenue for victory and support for Zionist objectives in the region. These are things that we can look up as historical proofs, both in primary and secondary documents at the time. This doesn't require one to have any attitudes that might not be deemed safe for those on YouTube to take issue with, but that's something to keep in mind.
Well, thank you for bringing that up. And just to add to that further, so as I mentioned before, again, in the Sykes-Picot Agreement, it said the bulk of Palestine was going to be an international zone. This was a settlement that neither Britain or France was particularly happy with. So when America enters the war under Woodrow Wilson and his belief in, for the sovereignty of all peoples, the British see a very cynical opportunity to get Palestine. So they essentially support Zionism and the promise of a Jewish national home there in order to secure it for themselves as a mandate after the war. Because if you look at the geography, Palestine is just northeast of the Sinai and Suez Canal. Britain wants to strategically cement its control of that area, hence why they want it so badly. And by promising it to the Jews, they can essentially secure it for themselves against the French. And another point as well is that obviously we've mentioned the fact that Russia was in the war, but then they bailed after the revolution. what's important is that once the revolution happens and the Bolsheviks signal that they are wanting to escape from the war, essentially, the British and French rip up all of the territorial concessions they had made to the previous Russian government. In retaliation, Trotsky has all of the secret treaties, Sykes-Picot, Palaiolog-Sassanov correspondence. He has all of that printed in Pravda and sent into national newspapers. So the whole world now knows about what the British and French were conspiring. This greatly angers Wilson. So again, another reason why Britain was doing this, because they wanted to try and mend relations with the Americans and make their intent seem a lot more friendly and considerate to the oppressed and disparate peoples.
Yeah, the Wilson sort of, I guess, concessions that you could say, because the British especially were trying to appeal to his more idealistic anti-imperial sentiments. I mean, this has been a long-running debate inside domestic American politics, especially as America enters the world stage, especially after the Spanish-American War in 1896. You get the sort of progressive anti-imperial wing that has just an odd mix of sort of progressives of the era, as well as sort of conservative types about the need to not get involved and to abandon sort of these inherited rights of previous Americans. William Jennings Bryan, Samuel Clemens, also known as Mark Twain, and others would be adamantly against it. And I mean, Wilson sort of adheres to this as well. I mean, he campaigns on not being in the war for re-election in 1916, but there's numerous diplomatic back channels that are happening even as the war breaks out when Wilson is in office. And one of the things that I think is very important to consider in this respect is that while a lot of Wilson's 14 points, as we sort of joke about them today in sort of this historical context of irony, one of the things that sort of does play a role here is we move from the word protectorate to mandate in this region. And a lot of that does sort of come from the Wilsonian influence also under the League of Nations for respects to the disparate and the diasporas of minorities in these territories. And so you'll see that play a large role in the formulation for Middle Eastern and Levantine states after the end of the First World War. And while, Trotsky does publish those things in Pravda, there's also that understanding that until sort of relations normalize later in the 1920s, from 1917 until, well, for America, it's 1927. I don't know about Britain. You have this sort of isolated state of Russia in terms of contact to the outside world. And it does play a substantial factor for how Russian interests are, of course, being thrown out in the midst of this new government being instituted under the Bolsheviks. But a very interesting time frame, to say the least, with respects to multi-imperial interests in the region. And now we're beginning to see the Zionist interests play a clear and present role right here.
Well, thank you for that. And just going back to this distinction between a protectorate and a mandate, I kind of see what you're saying. To what you believe, they're essentially the same thing. It's just a change of name.
I know there's a lot more difference to it. But yeah, no, go on for clarifying sake. I'm playing more to the fact of just sort of the American influence it has on this area, because you've got two drastically weakened and I would say just dispossessed by nature of just the loss of men during the First World War, that there is a lot more American pressure, more overrepresented, I would think, in the delegation in 1919 onward. But there's a clear difference between the two.
So just to clarify, so a mandate is a new term that's conceived by the League of Nations for the Sykes-Picot Agreement. A mandate is essentially a territory that the League of Nations grants a power, France or Britain, to govern, with the goal of the France or Britain sort of bringing the region up and preparing it for eventual independence, whereas a protectorate is simply a state where the ruler has a large degree of internal sovereignty and autonomy, but in respect to their foreign or religious or military matters, there is very heavy control and oversight from a foreign power. One famous example of this would be if you look at British India, though most of the country was under the control of the British Raj, ruled directly by the monarch and the representative of the viceroy. a good chunk of India was broken down into these princely states, and the most famous and most powerful being the Hyderabad, ruled by a Muslim Nizam. So these rulers were afforded a strong degree of autonomy, so long as they bent the knee to Britain, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely. But I'm playing more off of the Wilsonian influence for desire of the League of Nations, and I think that while America eventually does not go into this, primarily because any sort of treaty that would be present for America's ascension to it, of course, is killed in the Senate, because treaties require a substantial majority for them to be passed, that you see this sort of changing of the guard in respects to what we would call, or for those that study colonialism, you sort of see where this changes, and there's more direct governing control rather than autonomy. But it does illustrate that the mandate system gives a lot more leeway to original imperial aims than any kind of form of protectorate would, which I think in the end definitely benefited these European powers more than I think the Americans were expecting. And you begin to see this especially after the Second World War with respects to decolonialization, but that's a stream for another time.
No, indeed. So I'll now move on to the next slide. And so this concept of mandate and protectorate and the distinction is going to come up again shortly. Right. So after we've established all the different interests in this region, let's now look at the actual end of the war and the carving up of the turkey, so to speak. So, okay, so during the rest of the war, so the British put General Allenby in charge of their army in Egypt. He, along with the Arabs, push up the Levant and capture Damascus, as well as the Ottoman Levant, as their forces withdraw. Britain also keeps advancing at Mesopotamia until this whole region's under their control. Obviously, the war comes to an end, and then we have the two treaties. Initially, in 1920, you have the Treaty of Sevres, which is the much harsher treaty for carving up the Ottoman Empire. So not only do the French and British are granted their territorial concessions, but the French are granted a huge swathe of southern Turkey. There was a proposition to create a greater Armenia out of eastern Anatolia, and there's even a plan to have a plebiscite in what is a rump Kurdistan to potentially be established. And as you mentioned before, Prude, the Italians have an interest in the southwestern part of the country, so that potentially could have fallen under their sway. And also the British enticed the Greeks into as well by granting them the permission to not annex but occupy Smyrna in western Anatolia. And also this map is inaccurate because it claims Greece was promised Constantinople. That's not true. After Russia withdraws from the war, the British plan to take over the Straits themselves as some international zone. But obviously, as we know, so do you want to say something?
Oh, I was just going to say that the Straits kind of get their own diplomatic adjustment with like the Montreux Convention later in the 1930s. But yeah, the Russians nor the Greeks would get Constantinople, much to the dismay of the Christians in that area.
No, certainly. I mean, if people are interested in that, Apostolic Majesty, in the conclusion of his Orthodoxy, Autocracy, and Nationality, did a very good stream with Marcus of Eurus Pertinax on the full storm of a Greater Greece. A very sad event if you're an Orthodox Christian or Greek for that matter. So tangentially related to today's topic. So, but of course, the Turkish nationalists under Mustafa Kemal reject the Treaty of Sevres and they fight the Turkish War of Independence. They successfully push back, and in 1923 you have the new Treaty of Lausanne, which establishes these new boundaries. So you have a Republic of Turkey that controls pretty much all of modern-day Anatolia, and so the main losers in that are the French, because they now have lost this territory in Anatolia proper, but they still retain Syria and Lebanon. What's also important is there's another deviation other than Palestine regarding the original agreement. Lloyd George is able to entice another concession from the new French President Clemenceau. He's in the original agreement, the area around Mosul was supposed to be part of the French zone, but the British are able to pressure and pry Mosul away into their own zone. The reason they're able to do this is because essentially with the Paris Peace Accords, as I mentioned before, Woodrow Wilson, the American president, was very much interested in allowing peoples, giving them democracy and referendums to determine their own fates. He's actually planning to potentially do this in the territory of Alsace-Lorraine, the territory formerly part of France, which Germany had taken in 1870, 1871. This territory, the Alsatians aren't necessarily loyal to either France or Germany. They rather just want their own autonomy, whether under France or Germany. So the Americans are planning a plebiscite there, and it's not certain that the territory is going to be given to France. So Lloyd George essentially twists Clemenceau's arm and says, if you don't give us Mosul, we won't help you acquire Alsace-Lorraine, which was France's main goal in the war and the reason they lost so much men and prepared to fight so long and hard for. Hardfort agrees in that concession. But also the other main interest for attaining Mosul is, from surveys being done, they realise that there's a large deposits of oil in that region, which the British desperately want to fuel the Royal Navy, as very critically, just before the war, Winston Churchill, who was the First Lord of the Admiralty, makes the fateful decision to switch the fuel source of the Royal Navy from coal, a resource Britain was very much abundant in, to oil, because it was a much more efficient fuel source, even though Britain had little to no oil, except for the oil they were pumping out in Iran through the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. However, one thing Clemenceau is able to get out of the British is that he agrees to Mosul being ceded on the condition the British give a 25% share in the oil from this region, which they agree to. Any comment you want to make off the back of that, or?
The one thing I would add is that there is, despite this not being a heavily American presence, or this being something that has concerned at all really with the United States, is that America does have a delegation with respects to the Treaty of Lausanne, led by Rear Admiral Mark Bristol, who commanded the North Atlantic Fleet. He commanded the USS Oklahoma in World War I. He was also the U.S. High Commissioner to Turkey through 1919 to 1927. He would play a role with respects to how to handle Armenian relationships inside of Turkey, and was very much against any sort of Armenian plebiscite or having any mandate in Armenia that would come out of the League of Nations in respects to what happens inside of the Middle East. He also was not a very fan of Jews, Greeks, or the Armenians to begin with. He was a bit of a, I guess what you'd call a bigot in that respect, and he wasn't a fan of Mustafa Kemal and the British national movement. However, he was a delegate there, being the commissioner to Turkey, and of course was a supporter of these sort of Turkish interests, which in the treaty, which gave them far more control over their own territory and their borders, which of course would delimit the borders that we would see between nations like that of Greece and Bulgaria. So these get their islands more or less outlined effectively within the Aegean Sea, which of course are still being hotly debated to this day. The new blue policy or blue homeland policy of the Turkish government today, a lot of that still has to deal with the Treaty of Lausanne and numerous other Aegean agreements inside in the 1920s and 30s. And so at the same time, you also get population exchanges between the Greeks and the Turks as well. So even throughout both the beginning of World War I and the Balkan crisis in 1912 and 13, you're beginning to see this exchange of populations. All the Christians are leaving Turkey. All the Muslims are trying to come back into the Ottoman Empire. And that, again, still hammers itself out in the Treaty of Lausanne. But I find the fact that despite America not being participatory in the League of Nations, that in this treaty and in these conventions, the Americans are still here and are playing somewhat of a role in supporting Turkish interests. And we still kind of see that even to this day, that the American government doesn't always have the historical foresight or hindsight in mind with respects to the populations in there. But, Turkey, they understand, much like the British as well as the French did, as we've explored today, kind of recognize the geographic and strategic importance of Anatolia. And this treaty does sort of highlight, I think, much of where the current political boundaries sit today with respects to the Straits, the Black Sea, the Mediterranean, Aegean, and Turkey's position both both within its own problems inside of its ethnicities, between Turks, Armenians, Kurds, and the other ethno-religious minorities in the area. But this treaty does really illustrate that what we'll be dealing with. And I mean, yes, later on, of course, you'll get sort of the issues of Armenia and Azerbaijan later on, Greek-Turkish population exchanges, and of course the difficulties in their own ethnic divides. Despite them both being NATO members to this day, they both kind of beefed up their navies from French and German and British engineers and arms exporters and manufacturers. So a lot of this fighting and a lot of these concerns still happen. And most famously, the treaty also sort of grants immunity with the Declaration of Amnesty with crimes committed 1914 to 1922, most specifically the Armenian genocide. But yeah, the Lausanne tacitly endorsed these populations, according to some historians. But the treaty was just trying to wrap this up, get it over with. And the Turks had much more political influence than the previous one at Sevres.
Yes, because Lausanne would be the only example of one of the defeated powers being able to successfully undo a lot of the damage that the treaty that was imposed on them was going to do. So good for the Turks, I suppose, but not so good for the Greeks. Again, just going back to the American involvement in the creation of these mandates, what's important is that by this time it became apparent to the Americans that obviously they want to be certain that if they're going to grant, or the League of Nations is going to grant these mandates to Britain and France, do the people that actually want to be ruled by foreigners, essentially? They've just been freed from the Ottoman Empire. Do they really want to become part of someone else's empire? So what ends up happening is they set up a commission, the King Crane Commission, to survey the area. So King was a missionary, Crane was a businessman. So they would tour all 5 of the territories that would make up the mandates. The French were very much against this initially. However, they conceded to it in the end because they believed that if they were going to be hated in Syria and Lebanon, the British were probably also going to be hated in their region, so it would put them under pressure. So what ends up happening is the British, let's just say, fiddle things on the ground, and they manage to make sure the King Crane Commission don't visit Iraq at all. And when they go to Palestine and Jordan, they only find Arabs who are absolutely pleased and are looking forward to the rule of the British. How fortunate, right? And when they go to Lebanon and Syria, they find that, yes, the mood against them is quite negative. And when I discovered what I'm about to say, Prude, I was quite shocked and surprised. But due to how negative the perception of the French was in Lebanon and Syria, there was a moment when the Americans were considering taking over the mandate of Lebanon and Syria for themselves. So almost in history, you would have had the British and American rivalry in the Middle East decades sooner. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, from what little I do know of American interest this early, was that they had saw this, and they're again this is heavily stopped by domestic politics, and I cannot overstate sort of the anti-war sentiment that comes out of the First World War for the United States and this sudden regress to sort of return. But yeah, there was a substantial push inside of the Foreign Service, which wouldn't really get modernized until after well into 1926. But yeah, there was a desire to get the just sort of throw out the occupied enemy territory administration and have a much larger American presence there. I'm kind of glad that it didn't happen. I don't think that it would have boded well for the Americans to be in this area that soon. I mean, I don't really want the Americans, I don't want my government involved in the Middle East to begin with, but it does sort of, it would have been very interesting to see what would have happened, but that's one of those it would have been interesting to see what would have happened as well, because you still had individuals like Herbert Samuel and whatnot, who was one of the British administrators who's also a Zionist politician, as we sort of mentioned earlier. But I'd imagine that even if the Americans were involved there, I think we would have had a very similar heavy ethnic presence at the same time as well here in the U.S.
Well, no, thank you for your comments on that. So, obviously, the French are terrified of not getting their mandate. What ends up happening is the British, in the end, after the King Crane Commission visits, unsure as to what to do, because obviously, if we're looking at this map on the left, at this time, there was a body that set up in Damascus called the Syrian National Congress, which declares the Kingdom of Syria. So, just to clarify, so this black dotted line you see, this was the territory of 5 former vilayets of the Ottoman Empire that the Congress had claimed as part of the boundaries of the Kingdom of Syria. They declare Faisal, the third son of Sharif Hussein, to be the king of Syria. And what was essentially happen is the British decide that rather than side with either the French or the Arabs, they decide to essentially side with neither of them. And what they do is they withdraw their military presence in the area simultaneously. So they withdraw to just Palestine, the blue area, and they allow the French to come in and occupy the coastal area, Lebanon and coastal Syria, and they allow the Arabs to maintain the interior, and essentially hoping that to let the French and Arabs settle the matter among themselves. And the French essentially then invade the Kingdom of Syria, and we have the Franco-Syrian War of 1920. The French dispatch war veteran Henri Gourad, who absolutely crushes the Syrians at the Battle of Maysalun, after which he triumphantly struts into the tomb of Saladin in Damascus and kicks the tomb, exclaiming, "We're back." And in some sources, it's apparently believed that he claimed the cross has triumphed over the crescent, sort of conjuring up some ludicrous crusader larp on the French part, which is even more weird when you consider this is all done under the supposedly secular French Third Republic.
Yeah, and there was an article I was reading actually earlier, and I had posted a small snippet of it from, I think it's Asli Bali, who's a professor of law at the UCLA Law School, and this was from 2016. It was talking about, artificial states. And it was very interesting, and I'll read a small quote from this article where he says, with respects to the Sykes-Picot Agreement and what would later come out of these mandates, was that new maps are grounded in an explicit critique of the artificial borders of the Sykes-Picot order. One commentator argues that Sykes-Picot was inadvertently progressive for the Middle East, which isn't the sort of place where modern multicultural and multi-confessional states can be established. The states produced by the Sykes-Picot maps encompassed a cross-section of the underlying communal identities of the region. Such states were not only artificial but unsustainable, the argument goes, for a region where loyalties are tribal, ethnic, and religious. To echo a scholar writing in another context, preserving such borders might amount to a kind of cosmopolitan diktat, forcing diverse peoples to live together. Boy, where have I heard that before? Yet the historical evidence for the artificiality of the post-war Arab state system is rather thin. European powers had set the post-Ottoman Empire boundaries of Iraq through a process controlled by the British and French, but was impacted by historical antecedents, local actors, and national resistance movements. Ottoman maps from the 18th and 19th centuries clearly designated the 3 administrative provinces of Basra, Baghdad, and Mosul together as Al-Iraq, Al-Arabia. The geographical nomenclature adopted by the Mandate powers was a continuation of these Ottoman designations, themselves adaptations from earlier Arab dynasties dating back to the 8th century. Iraqi nationalists resisting British rule demanded independence within borders, coincided not only with the contours of the Mandate Iraq, but their own sense of political geography. As several historians of Iraq have shown, the origins of Iraq as an artificial state thesis, and he claims are colonial. The argument doesn't emerge as an indigenous critique of new boundaries, but as a British assertion that Iraq was not yet coherent enough to govern itself, contrary to the claims of Iraqi nationalists, end quote. I just found this article interesting because he's sort of talking about the, even with the American King Crane Commission traveling through Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria, sort of polling local political elites. There was a united and greater independent Syrian movement that had a lot of popular support. But as for local support for smaller units based on communal identities, they didn't see a point. I wonder how much of that is due to more of the I guess, more migratory or less settled nature of some of these groups. But it sort of does, to me, it always lies interesting that there were several ethnic groups, of course, that I think clearly gets shafted in this. I mean, even now in 2003, we had debates about what was to be done with the Kurds. I mean, the idea of an independent Kurdish state was heavily debated during the 2004 presidential election. Of course, you get the sort of Kurdistan regional government that exists in northwestern part of Iraq, which of course still has its own issues. Greater Syria was, according to the Ottomans, was always composed of Aleppo to Gaza, which of course constitutes three different really regions of like Palestine, Jordan, and Lebanon. But so much of this, right, you get these mandates that would sort of kind of play into what we would see as modern borders today. But a lot of it does work within those aliyet systems that you've mentioned throughout this discussion from the Ottoman Empire. And of course, there's still numerous groups that we're not going to, I think, ever see settled. And the closest thing I think we've seen to any sort of balanced system would be Lebanon. But even then, what's happening inside with, the government in Beirut just illustrates a lot of corruption and, of course, the battles between religions and ethnicities in that area. I don't know if you would ever find a perfect answer unless you had some large empire that would be able to effectively govern these. And so far, even with the borders that we have in the Middle East, those fights are still being slugged out with much larger powers like the United States or China and Russia playing a large role in those conflicts even now. So the lines and parting of the sand, as you called this this discussion, I mean, there's also these aftershocks of the tectonic shift and the transfer of power and governance from protectorate to mandate to these planned borders to now independent nation states with foreign direct investment money, the oil industry. I don't know if we'll ever live past, unless borders change in this area. We'll always live in sort of the shadow of Sykes-Picot and what came right after.
Well, thank you for your insights. And so something else I wanted to raise, and so I've just lost my train of thought. Sorry. Well, I just want to address this comment quickly. So the story about Gourad, I mean, that probably is fake, but it is amusing if it is true.
It would be.
Yes, I mean, trying to contrive some link back to the French rule during the Crusade times and like modern France just seems really silly to me, but that's besides the point.
Well, I remember rather famously George W. Bush, when talking about the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, he had said that we were going on a great crusade, and it was criticized by the French president and by numerous liberal critics that he was tone deaf in that respect. But, sometimes, even if it's just a myth, there's still that sort of undertone of mythology that, as well as real historical events that govern our political understanding of events. And I'm sure that this particular instance was, but I think that language is just never going to go away.
No, certainly not. So one other thing I want to say before we move the slide on. So again, I've mentioned before this stream AM did on the false dawn of Greater Greece and how that whole issue with the Greeks and the Turks is peripheral to this discussion. A thought which I've had recently, which I actually mentioned because I had a stream earlier this week talking to Marcus where I mentioned this discussion. And what I said to Marcus is that when you're looking at this is almost like you could say a false dawn of a Greater Arabia, because another point I forgot to mention earlier is that when dealing with King Hussein, one thing the British had promised him was that when the Ottoman Empire had been defeated, that they would potentially elevate him to the caliphate-ship, because the Ottoman sultans had traditionally been the caliphs of Islam, the international Islamic religious leader. And so by this, they were hoping to have some puppet caliph who would rule this Arabian Empire for them, and then be able, and that's something they could tap into with their Muslim subjects in other parts of their empire. you can imagine what the Arabs are being promised, this dream of this restored great Arab caliphate, but they don't get that. In fact, as we've seen from this image on the left, they don't even get a greater Syria. Instead, it's just smashed and carved up. So this is very much, you could say, a false dawn of a greater Arabia. Any final point to make before I move the slide on?
I think that one of the things to also consider would be the religious impact of that as well, right? Is we have different. I mean, I think most people are familiar, of course, with sort of Sunni and Shia Islam, which of course still plays a large role in there. But when we talk about caliphate, one of the things that I think is sort of important to keep in mind with respects to, say, Salafism and later Wahhabism, one of those things to keep in mind, of course, is the commemorations of the Saudi founding, whether it's the first emirate, right, of Muhammad ibn Saud in 1727, and of course its historical convention with the beginning in the 1744 Ibn al-Wahhab about the uncoupling of religious clergy. But I mean, these doctrines that you would see in here have a much more fundamentalist understanding, a true Salafist movement, and with these sort of calling people back to the real meaning of the oneness of God, focusing on more traditional Islamic practices. And so we get sort of, I mean, this House Saud is the real winner out of the issue of Saudi Arabia or the unification of Saudi Arabia throughout the beginning of the 1900s. And these various schools of Islam will play a long-standing role in this area. And of course, these sort of civilizational clashes, to sort of borrow off Huntington, they still play a role today. And a lot of it can be traced by European influences and how well it came out of these promises of what could be for Muslims in this part of the world. And clearly it didn't happen. And despite attempts by non-state actors and supporters of various interpretations of Islam, but so far no caliphate for the Mohammedans in the area.
No, and some other points to raise is later on, obviously, when the British were contriving of creating an international zone in Constantinople, they were actually considering keeping the Ottoman Sultanate around as just a Caliph of Islam, essentially having a very similar situation to the prisoner in the Vatican situation of the papacy in the late 19th and early 20th century before the Lateran Treaty with Mussolini's Italy. So you would have had this prisoner caliph in Constantinople, which the British would have kept hostage. But obviously the Turks were able to take back Constantinople, Istanbul, and in 1924 Ataturk abolishes the caliphate, forever denying that title to any other leader. And then where you've mentioned, obviously, the House of Saud, in 1926, the House of Saud conquer the kingdom of Hejaz, which by this point Hussein had died and his eldest son had become the new king. That's conquered. It's then ruled as a dual kingdom, the kingdom of Hejaz, Nejd, and in 1932 they're merged together into the new kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which would then go on to become essentially an American economic client with their oil, essentially, which I'm always struck by what the Saudis were able to achieve, that they were able to just essentially pick off a British protectorate so easily. But I guess the British Empire at that point was so stretched thin and had distractions elsewhere that they probably picked the right time to have done a move like that. Or what's your thought?
When one looks at sort of the history of what we call like decolonization or decolonialism, there's a widespread American presence that I don't think ever gets really addressed in this respect. And I mean, even when we get the Suez crisis, there's the British had of course gotten a long talk from the Americans that President Dwight D. Eisenhower had sort of told Britain not to invade, and there was a lot of political pressure where the Soviet Union and the U.S. are kind of on the same side on a sort of issue here. But I think that you look at the post-war situation, American foreign policy when it comes to, say, like decolonialism, that sort of liberal international ideal really takes a firm hold. Paul Gottfried talks about this in Anti-Fascism, A Course for Crusade, that the concept of imperialism sort of gets this weird rhetorical association with Lebensraum, and these things need to be addressed. This is why, the situation with French Indochina, for example, in Vietnam, the issue isn't they don't do much with respect to the French dealing with the resistance from the Vietnamese, but rather they're more concerned about this doctrine of the domino effect. So, the idea that the French losing out on French Indochina is just, in some extent, a fringe benefit, so they can focus on their own efforts. And so I think it's important to consider that, you have two world wars that, really just decimate population and the ability to maintain a sizable state of influence. It's sort of like the first instance, as well as what casually gets called the rise of the rest. I know that's sort of like people would associate that with Fareed Zakaria and his term about, the idea that other countries are going to modernize and be on par with sort of these Western states. But at the same time, you sort of see this here is that there is foreign investment in political groups and identities by the United States and its intelligence and state departments that want you to encourage this sort of rising up. And at the same time, right, if that means you can weaken this return of any sort of semblance of ancien regime or even the 19th century balance of power within Europe, then that has to be disrupted. And you want to have your own satrapies inside of Western Europe and other parts of the world challenged with your other rival, which at the time was the Soviet Union. And of course, the Middle East gets even more complicated between the Soviets getting involved later on in the 1980s. The Russians expanding, of course, with the Soviet satellite states, and then the rise of sort of Islamic fundamentalism, and that Westernizing, of course, was met with a stronger force, that being sort of, the Islamism of the 1960s, 70s, all the way up until today. And so it just really does illustrate that everything that we've just talked about for like the last 2 hours has been, they still play a large role in how, international systems influence this part of the world. And they all, for better or for worse, we're still governed by the Treaty of Lausanne, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and, these ideas of how the West, or by that I mean more so just really the Triple Alliance, how on earth they were going to handle the Middle East, the Levant after the war. And we are now living in the consequences of that.
And probably going to be living under those consequences for a long time going forward, unless, I don't know, some weird freak event happens, but we'll have to see.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, so I'll have a couple of slides dealing with each of these mandates separately. So let's tackle the French, Lebanon and Syria. So, okay, so we've got the two images here. So on the left, this is essentially the breakdown of the mandate of Lebanon and Syria into its regions and provinces. So initially, the French conceive of a federation. Although it's important, if you look on the right, this shows you the evolution of the territory of the mandate. So Lebanon, or what is actually Greater Lebanon, because Lebanon itself is just the mountain range where the Christian population live. So Greater Lebanon is a Lebanon that encompasses the Christian mountain area, but also the city of Beirut, which actually, as we've discussed previously, is France's main sort of diplomatic stomping ground, and would actually serve as the capital of the mandate as a whole. And also the northern areas would all encompass a Greater Lebanon. So that would always retain its autonomy within the mandate, while the rest of Syria is carved up into a series of 4 states. So Syria proper is broken up into a southern state, the state of Damascus, and a northern state, the state of Aleppo, with the 2 significant religious minorities, the Alawites in the coast and the Druze in Jabal al-Druze, and being given their own states and autonomy within this federal system. However, most Arab nationalists and Syrians are infuriated with this arrangement, because what this is, though it's appearing to be granting autonomy to these different areas and groups, what it really is just a system of the French playing divide and rule, as in each state there would be an Arab governor who would then have advising him over the shoulder a French délégué or delegate, essentially, though on the surface it appears to be a civilian federation, in reality it's a French military rule proxied into these five different areas. This gets so the response to this from the Syrians is so intense that in order to calm things down in 1924, the French do abolish the idea of a federation, and they do merge Damascus and Aleppo together into one large state. And eventually in the 1930s, they do create what's called a Syrian Republic within the Mandate, and where they incorporate the autonomous groups into a greater Syria. Any comments to make on what I've said so far?
The only thing I would just simply add is that never underestimate sort of the majority's desire to rule over the minority. But yeah, the what you had described as the French divide and rule bit is very true in this respect. I don't think that the map that we have here on screen for 1922, I don't think it would have been manageable lest there was a military intervention to maintain it. And that clearly didn't happen the way that it did. And the French had coalesced around these Syrian concessions. And although, of course, Lebanon would maintain later on in its more present configuration sort of a balance between these groups. Syria's government, especially with Assad, right? Both the present president of Syria, but also his predecessors, have maintained a hearty balance with religious groups inside the area. Bashar al-Assad himself is an Alawite. He's not a Muslim. So it does sort of illustrate sort of that balancing of ethno-religious differences inside here. And it's modern Syria has its own issues, of course, but prior to its ongoing civil war and the Arab Spring and the issues of foreign intervention, it was one of those states that you had seen by international relations scholars as ways to sort of balance with the majority its minority client populations politically inside its own country, similar to how the Austro-Hungarian Empire was managed, but that's sort of all been thrown up in the air now with the respects to the Syrian civil war and American investment and interest in there. But it does illustrate, I think, what is the proto-formulation of the Syrian state and what it looked like originally and what these populations looked like, and that what we have done with respects to, say, the Islamic State or ISIL and American intervention in here has done more damage towards the Alawite and Christian and Druze minorities than it has the greater Syrian Muslim population.
No, certainly, and thank you for your comments on that. So there was another point I wanted to bring up, but I'm blanking on it. Right, what I'll do is I'll move on to the next slide, and if it comes back to me, I'll just go over it. So now to Palestine and Transjordan. So this is where the mandate protectorate distinction comes in again, because so Palestine and Transjordan were one mandate. However, due to a lot of Arab anger over the concessions to Jewish settlement in Palestine, the British have to make a concession. So what they do essentially is they split the mandate in two. On the west, you have what's called mandatory Palestine, which is governed directly by the British. And then in the east, you have the Emirate of Transjordan, which is a protectorate. So what they do essentially is that when you have the Franco-Syrian War and Faisal's kicked out of Syria, the British are needing a ruler in this area because Abdullah was actually marching through Transjordan with an army to help his brother. What the British do with Winston Churchill, who's the colonial secretary, does with Lawrence of Arabia as his advisor, is they offer Abdullah a protectorate in Transjordan, which he accepts. So they set him up as a ruler there. So there's one deviation. So you have a mandate where half of it is a mandate, the other half is a protectorate. So obviously the Jewish settlement is restricted purely to Palestine proper and not Transjordan, despite the consternations of certain Zionist interests. but this is purely to keep the Arabs partially on side. As a concession to Jewish anger, what the British do is, you've mentioned Herbert Samuel before. Well, the British put him up as the first High Commissioner for Palestine, and the reason they do this is because he's actually of Jewish ancestry, so they can deflect claims that they're being anti-Semitic by planting him in there. Any comment you want to make on this slide?
The only thing that I would simply add is that there is a lot invested in these mandates. You have the what's the word I'm looking for? Has a military force. I'm trying to remember what it's called. It's
Do you mean the Arab Legion?
No. The Transjordan Frontier Force that's what I was looking for, because it was created by the British High Commissioner for Palestine. So you've got Herbert Samuels there, and then it was a way to, in respect to the Transjordan Mandate, this was in sort of the contrast to the Arab Legion, which was more internal security. This was more external, and it had a lot of troops from the Arab Revolt and a lot of members that were funded by the British and French that were supported with the Hashemite cause during the First World War. And Amir Abdullah, which I think is who you've got he's pictured right there. He was part of it. He was an honorary colonel, and so you have a lot of this international force backdrop of armed men that had fought for the British cause, subsidized by the French and the British, are now playing this military force, and this new mandate system feels very familiar to anyone who's got a recent memory of the last 20 years of how that's played a role in Middle East politics.
And that certainly, and just going back to the Arab Legion, because that's a crucial linchpin of British strategy, because the Arab Legion, for those who don't know, was an Arab military force of Arab soldiers led by British officers that were stationed in and recruited from Transjordan, and it was a crucial military linchpin between Palestine and British Iraq. And some of you may be familiar with their famous commander from 1939 until its dissolution in 1956 was a certain John Baggot-Glubb, British general, who, for those who may know, is one of the subjects of the academic agent's forthcoming book, The Prophets of Doom. He's an absolutely fascinating figure, and I've actually got some books of his on the way, because I look forward to reading some of his thoughts, because he was an officer who I think was very much sympathetic to the Arab cause, in contrast to a lot of the pro-Zionist support you see amongst other British elites and leaders.
Absolutely. He was far more sympathetic to the Arab causes and the Arabization of this region. And I know everyone knows him for Fate of Empires and The Search for Survival, but almost all of the books that he has ever written and all of the works that he has ever contributed to are stories of the Arab Legion, Britain and the Arabs, A Study of 50 Years, The Great Arab Conquest, The Course of Empire, The Arabs, Their Successors, The Lost Centuries, from Muslim Empires to the Renaissance of Europe, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. I mean, this man knew them better than, say, the Zionists on the other side of sort of the British government at the time.
Well, thank you for your insight into Glubb. No, I look forward to reading those books of his when they do arrive. So on that point, let's move on to the final mandate, which is Iraq. So like the French, in 1920, the British have a revolt on their hands because, contrary, shock horror, the Arabs weren't entirely happy with British colonial rule. So what ends up happening is the original mandate that was planned, the mandate for Mesopotamia, is scrapped, and the British instead have a new mandatory Iraq, or in its absurdly longhand form title, the Kingdom of Iraq under British administration. So what they do is they prop up Faisal from before as the new King of Iraq. And so this, from 1922 to 1932, Iraq, though formerly called a mandate, is effectively a protectorate like Transjordan. And after 1932, it's given a token independence, but there's still significant British military influence, especially as there's a major Royal Air Force base in the country. And later, as I mentioned before, oil's found in Mosul. So the British and the French and even the Americans can invest in this region, and a pipeline is set up which goes from Kirkuk to Haifa and then splits, with one pipeline going through Transjordan to Haifa, supplying the British Mediterranean fleet, and the other pipeline going through French Syria, making sure the French get their share of the oil. So on the right there, I have Percy Cox, who was the first British High Commissioner for Iraq. So any comment you want to make regarding Iraq?
I would make a comment on Sir Percy Cox, because that his role inside of sort of the British interests inside the Middle East during the First World War is got probably one of the most important consequences. We mentioned the House of Saud earlier, and what would later be the unification of Saudi Arabia throughout the 1900s until the late 1920s, is that one of the major things that Sir Percy Cox had to do, who is also a British military officer who had served inside British India at the time, prior to the World War I, but his main priority inside of in Iraq was to ensure that Ibn Saud of the House of Saud does not join the Ottoman Turkish side in World War I. He signs a treaty in 1916, if I remember correctly, basically just subsidizing House of Saud to, like, don't get in the war, we'll pay you £5,000 a month to not bother, which sounds very familiar to a lot of American policy in here. Oh, we'll just pay you money so you guys don't fight. But he also knew that Sir Mark Sykes was, also he was part of, with Sharif Hussein, part of the other desert kingdoms that were there. And there was a lot of balance of power being trying to maintained by various British officers, whether it be Sir Percy Cox or Mark Sykes, and when General Maud took Baghdad in 1917. So you've got all of these different political officers inside of the British Empire that are desperately trying to maintain a balance of power with various small desert kingdoms and houses to ensure that they don't join against their efforts against the Turks. And so, yeah, this is a very important thing there. He would be the acting minister of Tehran with the Anglo-Persian agreement that would happen in August 1919. And he would later have to deal with, of course, the Iraqi revolt in 1920 and be the first high commissioner there alongside with King Faisal there. It's on screen. Just sort of these things that I think are very important for people to keep in mind, that, we'll talk about this mandate, but if you didn't have Cox there negotiating that treaty, you wouldn't have our relationship or understanding of what Saudi Arabia would become would be vastly different.
Yes, because at this time, I think things are very much up in the air, and anything kind of goes depending where the chips would fall. So as an addendum to Iraq, I want to talk a bit more about the oil situation. So I mentioned this pipeline. So this pipeline had been planned for years. There were several delays, but it wasn't constructed until 1934. So now to talk about the company that ran that, which was nowadays it's called the Iraqi Petroleum Company, but at the time it was absurdly called the Turkish Petroleum Company. And in an agreement, when the pipeline was first decided to be built, there were many key interests. The main person I want to talk about here was a Mr. Kalust Gulbenkian, who was an Armenian oil engineer and prospector. He had actually served the Ottoman Interior Ministry in surveying this land, and after the war he would go over to Iraq and work with the British. And he was known as Mr. 5% because he had a habit of setting up oil companies and retaining a 5% stake in each one. So you can imagine why he did that. He made a lot of money if you have 5% of all these different companies. So in this agreement, there were four different stakeholders other than him. So you have Royal Dutch Shell, which was shared with the British and French, who acted through the Anglo-Saxon Petroleum Company. You have the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, Anglo-Persian, which is based in Iran, acting for the Darcy Exploration Company Limited. They own another share. You then have the Compagnie Française de Pétrole, or the French Petroleum Company, acting as the sole French share. And then lastly, you have an actual American share, where Standard Oil and Socony Vacuum come together, and then the East Development Corporation having another stake. So you see all of the not only British and French but American investment into the development of oil in this region. So any comment you want to make on this table?
Not too much, other than just that I guess what gets colloquially known as the petrodollar does have its formulations in the post-World War I era of formulating British interests for petroleum in there. Like you mentioned earlier, the French, oil still makes the world go round, and we're still going to be heavily invested in this region for a considerable length of time until we move past it or find a way to drill it ourselves elsewhere.
Well, that's if we keep. I don't know what if we keep persisting in this climate, green energy fundamentalist bullshit. So, but we'll see. Okay, and after then, the next matter to address is, so though they've established these mandates, they wouldn't remain peaceful the entire time. Both the British and the French have to deal with major Arab revolts in these territories. So the first one to talk about is the so-called Great Syrian Revolt of 1925-27. Sometimes in modern Syria, it's called the Syrian Revolution. This, again, was largely as a result of the French military rule in the mandate. And what's really interesting about this uprising is that it's spearheaded by the figure on the left, Sultan al-Atrash. That's his name, not a title. The al-Atrashes were a Druze family of quite significance and renown, and Sultan al-Atrash is the main leader of this uprising, which is spearheaded by the Druze, which is even more remarkable considering the Druze are a tiny fraction of Syria's population. They're about 3%. So you have this small, obscure sort of syncreticist faith of Islam, Gnosticism, and many other faiths all cobbled together, spearheading a Syrian nationalist uprising in the mid-20s. Because despite his belief in the faith of his followers, Sultan al-Atrash went out of his way to avoid any overt references to religion, and he very much wanted the revolt to be a sort of a wider Syrian uprising against French colonial rule. And if you read the declaration that the revolutionaries made, their fourth point is we want to be independent and we want to abide by the ideals of the French Revolution, which is even more absurd considering they're revolting against the Third Republic France. So do you have any comment on the Syrian revolt there, Prude?
The Sultan al-Atrash's point about sort of avoiding religion, I think, was probably the smartest move that he would make. I mean, of course, these revolts didn't have the same sort of result as the Iraqi revolt, which of course got King Faisal installed, and which had far more Iraqi autonomy than, say, the one that we get inside of Syria, because the Great Syrian Revolt is sort of meant with a far greater French victory. You still get to maintain your mandate, but of course, the consequence of any sort of defeat like this, of course, is going to be an increase in Syrian nationalism, and this is what makes Syria such a unique territory and where it's situated, because al-Atrash, of course, doesn't make an explicit form to religion. He's rebelling against the French Republic, and they want to maintain this sort of spirit of the French Revolution, which sort of reminds me of how a lot of ethnic groups in, say, what we would call, like, quote unquote the global South will push things for, like, Marxism, but it's just these slightly bits of ethnic and religious interests that are just slapped on with a bit of Western thought. But, you have the Sunnis, the Druze, and the Alawites that are all sort of pushing for this great revolt against the French, and that the Arab kingdom of Syria was just not working out the way that they had wanted it to be. And so you get this push after a long series of influences from, say, the King Crane Commission. The report, of course, delivered to the U.S. it was concerned about, well, what are we supposed to do? We can't do much anyways, not to mention the political capital for Wilson's gone. Then you have the Syrian National Congress. The French have a lot more control over it than, say, the British do with respects to Iraq. And in this instance, what comes out of it, of course, is marches towards Damascus. The Syrian army in 1920 is dissolving at this point, but you still get rebellions throughout the midst of this, which of course this revolt is, with Alatrash and numerous others such as Sadiq Hazma, and they were to ensure that they could fight back effectively. And one of the things that I think that they were really trying to pull off, that they're all major cities. These are not just out in the desert. These are not just out in little bits of pieces of Syrian territory, but rather instead ways to really let the French know that this is not going to work. But of course, the French military is quick to settle this down, and some of the leaders would have their homes shelled. Damascus would be shelled and put in flames. And so, yeah, it really does illustrate that got to be careful who you're fighting. And the French are known historically throughout, whether it be, even today in sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of the Middle East, to quickly put things down. This is just, there's a lot of historical backdrop for this, and this is one of them.
I wouldn't quite call it quick, because initially their forces they have stations. Sorry, carry on.
Well, I don't mean quick, but it's like the years up here on there. But what I mean is quick to mobilize would be the correct word.
Well, the main thing, because initially the forces do terribly because they kept being ambushed by the Druze in the Hars territory of that region of Syria, and it's only after, because at the same time the French are dealing with an uprising in Morocco as well, and it's only after that, because it's the Rift War, where both Spain and France have significant trouble pacifying Morocco. So only after the French secure their section that they're finally able to move tens of thousands of troops under Maurice Gamelin over to Syria to finally crush the revolt. But also, another point I wanted to raise earlier, but I've only just remembered, is because it's to do with the High Commissioner, because obviously when this Great Syrian Revolt breaks out, the High Commissioner for the Levant was a Monsieur Sorel. He's forced to resign as he's blamed for causing this uprising, and his replacement is a certain Henri de Jouvenel. Henri de Jouvenel only governs the territory for about 6 months, but what's noteworthy, as if you may have guessed from the name, he's actually the father of philosopher Bertrand de Jouvenel. And to make this even more of an amusing coincidence, is we talked earlier about Syria having, obviously you've got this Sunni Muslim majority, but you've got these various minorities, the Alawites and the Druze. So with the early division of the territory, one can't help but think, but there is some kind of high-low versus middle mechanism going on here. Do you have anything to add to that?
The only thing I will add is that the French military still uses the Syrian revolt in their study, like how we study. Americans still study for instance, the Suez Crisis, both in the Sergeant Major's Academy and in West Point Military Academy, and the French equivalents study these revolts, as well as Algeria in their war college studies. It's the one historical factor that I can add here, is that the lasting impact of this is still taught in French war colleges.
Oh, that was something I didn't know. So thank you for bringing that up. So I mean, the legacy of this revolt results, as you can see, Sultan Alatrash lived a long life, not dying until the 80s. But even later into his life, he would receive honors from Hafez al-Assad, the father of current president Bashar al-Assad. So he was a figure who was very much associated with Syrian national independence and their struggle against the French. So I now want to move on to the other revolt, this time one that was in British Palestine, the Arab Revolt in 1936-39. The leader of this one was Amin al-Husseini, who I've pictured on the right. He was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, and he's significant because after the abolishment of the Caliphate and the annexation of the Hejaz by the Saudis, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem is the only real significant Muslim religious authority in the Middle East. So a lot of Arabs looked up to him for inspiration, and the alliance with the Grand Mufti was critical to British support from the Arabs leading up to this, but his turning away from them was crucial and what led to a revolt breaking out. So I mean, this conflict was wildly destructive. You have lots of instances of Arabs just straight up murdering Jews, attacking villages. burning them to the ground. I mean, this was largely as a result of Jewish immigration into Palestine, because, for example, in 1921, the population of Palestine was only 9% Jewish, but by this time it had risen to about being 25% Jewish, being around 355,000 people. So you can understand why the Arabs were alarmed with this turn of events. And the British struggled to deal with the violence because it's unlike anything they'd ever seen before. So what ends up happening is about 2 years in 1938, they have a Lord Peel visit the area in the Peel Commission to decide what to do with the mandate. And the Peel Commission's findings is they decide that in the future it's probably best that the mandate is partitioned into a Jewish and Arab zone. This greatly upsets both the Jews and the Arabs. So before this, there had actually been a brief pause in the terror and violence, but after this comes out, the Arabs resume their campaign. Eventually, the British are forced to bring in a certain Charles Teggett, who was a former police constable commissioner in India, specifically Calcutta, and he massively cracks down on the violence. As one point I need to bring up is during both the Great Syrian Revolt and the Palestinian Revolt, is both the Arab rebels flee into the other mandate for shelter. So the Syrians flee into Palestine. In fact, Sultan al-Atrash, I mentioned before, actually is forced into exile until 1937. But also Palestinian Arabs go north into reside in French Syria and Lebanon, away from the British, meaning when the respective powers try to get at the rebels who have fled, neither government wishes to help them because, to the British mind, they know the French are unpopular, so they don't want to prop them up to avoid angering the Arabs. But later on, the French say, well, you didn't support us when we had a revolt, so why should we help you? So it's sort of interesting that there seems to be this reluctance, despite the fact that British and French are supposed to be colonial partners and allies, that they're unwilling to help each other with their own colonial quandaries. And was there any point you want to make in that respect?
The one thing that I will add was just that the British putting King Faisal in after the Iraqi revolt was, when you're talking about support for other colonial powers in the area, was in part because they didn't want Faisal joining in with the Syrian revolt. And that the Arab desire to push a certain group of people into the sea well predates the creation of Israel in 1948. But again, this region, demographic change and replacement does illustrate that people will fight back when necessary.
I mean, it's completely understandable reaction, but in the modern world we live in, we're supposed to think that it's completely unnatural and unnecessary. But so going back to historical events, so as Charles Taggart comes in, because one thing he does to prevent rebels fleeing north into Syria is he builds a massive barbed wire and wall along the border, and he has this patrolled with soldiers armed with shotguns and attack dogs. I believe he also has mines laid as well. What he also does is that he orders the British military to be a lot more aggressive. So the British soldiers, if they see any Arab that looks suspicious, they have the right to interrogate them and torture them for information. And if they can trace rebels to any village, they will turn up to that village. And as you can see in the image, they would shell them with bombs, artillery. And in some instances, if the inhabitants of the villages wouldn't share information, they would even commit arson. So pretty wild, violent stuff going on here. And at this point, something I want to turn to now is what is the Jewish perspective in all this. So at this time, the Jews believe in a concept which was called havlaga, or self-restraint, which is the idea that the British have promised us that we'll have our own state eventually, so let's not antagonize the Arabs, let's be loyal to the British, and let's not cause any trouble. This starts to suffer some this policy comes under severe scrutiny within the Jewish community after the Peel Commission proposes partitioning the mandate. So on the left, you have the emblem of Haganah. This is the main Jewish self-defense force that Jews used to patrol their own territory and defend themselves against Arab reprisals. So with the Peel Commission, what ends up happening is a radical faction of Haganah breaks off, becoming Irgun, or a well-known Jewish terrorist organization. And no, that's not hyperbole. They would commit, terrorist acts, including shooting, bombing, and blowing up many Arab Palestinians in a campaign of violence throughout 1938. Also, at this time, on the right, I have General Ord Wingate pictured. Though he's more famous for the Chindate's campaign of the Second World War in Burma, he was involved here because he was someone who belonged to, shall we say, a radical evangelical Christian sect called the Plymouth Brethren, who was sympathetic to Zionism. So he sets up a set of a volunteer unit of Jewish counterinsurgency agents who, again, are going to raid Arab villages to try and deal with these Arab rebels in reprisal strikes. So we can see on all parts the violence is massively ratcheting up, and as you can imagine, it got far too much. So is there any comment you want to make on the Jewish response?
Not particularly, actually. I think that just really what you had outlined illustrates that the restraint aspect would slowly disappear as there was a greater and greater push from more Zionist policy and public figures, both inside Britain, later on the United States, and that things escalated very quickly in that respect.
Right. Thank you. And the one last final point I want to make on this is that in 1939, the British government published a white paper on Palestine. So in this white paper, several things are confirmed. They overturn the Peel Commission and declare that the mandate will not be partitioned. They declare that within 10 years, they will create a sole Palestinian state, which will consist of both Jews and Arabs in a power-sharing arrangement. Jewish immigration to Palestine is going to be limited to 15,000 people per year for the next 5 years, after which it's down to the Arab majority whether any further Jewish immigration is permitted. So as you can imagine, the Jews were not too happy about that arrangement, but the Arabs were content. What is important, though, is the calculation for the British decision here is that in 1939, things were heating up towards the Second World War. Obviously, the antagonist to Britain is Nazi Germany, who, as we shall obviously can declare, was not pro-Jewish by any stretch of the imagination. So the British logic was, well, the Jews don't like us, but they have to support us because they're not going to support the Germans, are they? So it's more important for us to please the Arabs. So this white paper manages to diffuse tensions for the time being. And on that basis, that is an appropriate time for us to end the stream for today, because we plan to do a part 2 on your channel where we'll go over the rest of the period and sort of longer term consequences going forward. So is there any final comments you want to make, Prudentialist?
The only thing I would add is that sort of Mr. Wingate's bit here and his role in there, he dies in the Second World War in a plane crash inside of India. But he was in Palestine when the war broke out, and his time there, both during the revolt and at the outbreak of the war, he played a very important role in trying to preserve and maintain British oil supplies. He was fighting against a lot of Arab and Muslim saboteurs against British oil pipelines inside Palestine, and was an advocate in his Zionism for a Jewish army to be created in Palestine to defend British interests in both Palestine and the Middle East, while Britain had to fight the Second World War against the Third Reich. It's just very interesting to see how that all played out. But yeah, we'll be covering. I know this region a lot better, World War II onward, in respects to both modern international relations. So I look forward to covering it with you. And thank you for having me on to discuss this. I think that one really cannot. There's been some argumentation by some international relations scholars, and this was around 2016, from a few think tanks that said we live in a post-Sykes-Picot world. And I disagreed with that wholeheartedly. I think that may have been jumping the gun with respects to the rise of the Islamic State and the ongoing financing of various fundamentalist groups throughout the Middle East. But these territorial lines that emerge from Sykes-Picot and then later the mandate system and then eventually the, I guess, independence of these respective countries. We haven't escaped this. These, like I mentioned earlier in our discussion, the lines that are still on the map in the sands have not changed relatively at all in 100 years. And lest, again, some war breaks out and some major territorial concessions are brought out, really the only place where that is still happening is inside of Israel. And that is a whole other can of worms to break into. But Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Syria, and Turkey, I mean, those are relatively stable. And a lot of this does still come back to those agreements that were drafted out by Georges Picot and Sir Mark Sykes in 1916. And you're not escaping that anytime soon.
No, absolutely not. And you bring up the Islamic State there because it's interesting, because if you look back, I believe one of their leaders early on said, our goal is simple. Is the creation of a caliphate and the destruction of the Sykes-Picot order. That is the literal words of the leader of the Islamic State. So had they got their way, I think we would have actually seen a new modern Arab Sunni caliphate in the Middle East. But as we've seen with events, that was not to be. So again, perhaps I think for the better in some way that they weren't successful, because the violence that we've seen in this region, as bad as it's been, I think would have been a whole lot worse had they succeeded.
Wholeheartedly agree.
Okay. And right, so before we end for today, does anyone in the chat have any final questions before we go? And what I will just another point actually regarding the French in Syria from 36 to 39, just to cover the end bit. There's a notable treaty in 1936 called the Syrian Independence Treaty, which would have seen the French government agree to grant Syria independence within 25 years, gradually. But what's also key of that treaty is emphatically Lebanon is separated and not be part of Syria, but the Jabal al-Druze and the Latakia Alawite states will be part of Syria going forward. However, despite the French government signing off on this, the French Parliament legislature actually refuses to ratify the treaty against its own government, just showing how much of a basket case and dumpster fire interwar France was. And also, another method by which the French really piss off the Syrians is that in 1938, under pressure from Kemal Ataturk in Turkey, they decide to hold a referendum in the Hatay area around Alexandretta, and the Turks bus in loads of Turks from over the border to rig the referendum, which ends up in the creation of the independent Hatay state from 1938 to 39. And then in 1939, the Hatay state dissolves itself and joins Turkey. And that has since then been a sore sticking point between Syria and Turkey, because today Syria still claims that region. And you can understand why in the Syrian civil war, the Turks happen to supply the Syrian rebels that control that area in the northern part of the country, because I think it helps secure their strategic position against any further Syrian encroachment on their former lost lands. So we've not had any questions. So anything you'd like to share, Prudentialist, before we go?
Oh, I couldn't help but chuckle that you'd mentioned that was 1936, because I mean, at the same time, you have the Montreux Convention regarding the regime of the Straits, which has been still a rather well-known governing document with respects to how to handle access to the Sea of Marmara and the Black Sea, and it remains unchanged to this day. It's still considered it was invoked actually when the war broke out between Russia and Ukraine. It was very quick for Turkey to invoke it to ensure that you didn't get any Western naval forces in there and to sort of try and close up that territory before it escalated or spilled over. But like you mentioned, northern Syria, that sort of quick existence of a state that sort of now doesn't exist. It's also being part of, again, the ongoing Turkish dispute with the Kurdish ethnic population inside its own country, because the West, especially the United States, still supports a lot of Kurds within that northern territorial border between Syria and Turkey, which has been a pain in the rear for both the Turks as well as the Syrian government. And even now, it's been a way to sort of conduct a war of attrition for ethnic extermination. And so, yeah, like, again, these parting of the sands, these lines and territories, no plebiscites for the Kurds, and even now that's been an ongoing ethnic and territorial and terrorist problem now for well over 50 years, since the 1970s, more in a modern context. But yeah, it does really illustrate to me the importance of understanding the history of these borders and where they come from, and the demographic geography. And you've done a really good job with your research, and I hope I can be just as well equipped to help answer more for 1939 onward.
Well, thank you. You've been indispensable for this discussion with your insight of international relations. So thank you once again for coming on. So anything to shill, or?
Well, if you don't know who I am, I am the Prudentialist. I cover international relations, culture, and politics, both on the local level, but also just widespread cultural stuff here in the West. Big fan of Apostolic Majesty and everyone who's ever been a pawn on that show, including Hitman himself. So if you haven't subscribed to Hitman's channel and you're here because of me, go hit subscribe and be sure to follow him and what he does, as well as Apostolic Majesty. Those are the main history people that I listen to. So if you want to get a good historical understanding of things, be sure to follow all of the gentlemen that AM has had on, including Hitman. So thank you for having me on.
Oh, thank you. In terms of my own shilling, earlier this week I did a stream with Marcus Pertinax going over the book My Reminiscences of East Africa by Paul von Netter-Vorbeck, The Lion of Africa. That's going to be a two-part. Part one we ended with at the beginning of 1916. In the coming weeks we will resume and finish off with part two. There's going to be a part two to this discussion on Prudentialist channel, so watch this space and for that as well. And of course I'm always thinking up new discussions, so you'll no doubt see more content from me in the future. So thank you everybody for watching, and good night.